She was never supposed to come back. 5 years ago, Evelyn Carter was thrown out of the most dangerous empire in New York with nothing but the clothes on her back and a secret she couldn't yet name. Damian Moretti believed she'd sold him out. He didn't ask questions. He didn't give her a chance to speak. He just ended it. Cold, final, absolute. And she disappeared into a city that swallowed people whole. Now the black envelope has arrived. The wax seal, the crest, his name, and Evelyn Carter is done hiding. If this story hits something real in you, hit like, drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this reaches. Now stay with me, because what happens next changes everything. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, which Evelyn would later think was somehow appropriate. Tuesdays were unremarkable, forgettable, the kind of day you didn't brace for, which made them the most dangerous kind. She was in the kitchen of her brownstone on the Upper West Side when Marcus, her head of security, set it on the counter beside her coffee without a word. He didn't have to say anything. The black paper, the embossed crest, the particular weight of it, she felt it before she even touched it, the way a scar aches before rain. She picked it up, turned it over. The seal was burgundy wax pressed with the Moretti crest, an eagle clutching a key, wings spread so wide they bled past the circle's edge. She'd seen that crest on everything once. Cufflinks, letterhead, the iron gate of an estate she'd never thought she would leave in the back of a car with nothing but a burner phone and $300 in cash. Evelyn set her coffee down. She didn't open the envelope immediately. She stood at the counter in her silk robe with her hair loose and her reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she just looked at it, breathing. In through the nose, 4 counts. Out through the mouth, 4 counts. A trick a therapist had taught her during the second year when she'd been surviving on contract consulting work and sheer obstinacy and the terrifying, clarifying love of 3 newborns who needed her to hold herself together. Marcus, she said, already ran it for toxins. He said, it's clean. She picked it up and broke the seal. The card inside was cream-colored stock, heavy as a stone. Engraved type, classical font, the kind of thing that cost more to print than most people spent on a week of groceries. You are cordially invited to the Moretti Foundation's annual charity gala. The Grand Ballroom, the Ashford Hotel, Manhattan. 8 o'clock in the evening. At the bottom, in handwriting she recognized from 5 years of trying to forget it, black ink, sharp angles, the pen pressed hard enough to leave a faint ridge in the paper. 2 words. Come home. Evelyn set the card on the counter. She took her coffee. She walked to the window that looked out over the brownstone small garden, where the morning light was coming in sideways, and the Japanese maples she'd planted the first spring after moving in had turned deep red with the season. 3 small pairs of sneakers were lined up by the back door. 3 different colors. Luca always insisted on blue. Marco wanted green, and Nico always chose red, because he said it was the loudest color and he wanted people to see him coming. She stood there for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She knew because she was counting. Then she turned around. Get Elena on the phone, she said, and call down to the garage. I need to know if the Rolls is scheduled this weekend. Marcus looked at her across the kitchen island with the expression he always wore when he thought she was making a decision that was going to cost someone something significant. He'd been with her for 4 years. He knew better than to argue. Yes, ma'am, he said, and left the room. Evelyn picked up the invitation again, looked at those 2 words. Come home. That was never your home to offer, she said to no one, to the empty kitchen, to the ghost of a man who still didn't know what he'd destroyed. Then she finished her coffee and went upstairs to wake her sons. The boys were already awake. They were always already awake. Evelyn had read 3 different books about children's sleep schedules and had come to the conclusion that her sons had read them too and decided collectively to disregard all recommendations. At 5 years old, Luca, Marco, and Nico operated on a schedule that seemed to be governed entirely by internal combustion and mutual agreement, and that schedule involved waking before 6 regardless of bedtime. She stood in the doorway of their room and watched them for a moment before they noticed her. Luca was on the floor building something out of magnetic blocks with the focused intensity he applied to everything. He would sit still for an hour working out a structural problem, patient in a way that still sometimes made Evelyn's breath catch, because it was so precisely, painfully familiar. Marco was on the bed with a picture book, though he was mostly narrating his own version of the story aloud to himself, louder than necessary, the way he did everything. And Nico was standing at the window with both hands pressed against the glass, watching something down in the street with absolute absorption. All three of them had dark hair, olive skin, and eyes that were gray. Not blue, not green, but a particular cool gray that caught light the way certain stones do, like there was something solid living just beneath the surface. Damien Moretti's eyes. All three of them. Every time. Evelyn had made her peace with it, mostly. Some mornings were easier than others. "Mom's here," Marco announced, as though reporting for an audience. Luca looked up from his blocks. Nico stayed at the window another 5 seconds. He always finished what he was doing before redirecting attention, and then turned around. "There's a dog down there," Nico said. "A big one, black." "Good morning to you too," Evelyn said. "Morning," all three of them said in a ragged chorus, Nico already turning back to the window. She came in and sat on the edge of Marco's bed. He immediately leaned against her, book abandoned. Luca went back to his blocks. Nico remained at the window, though she could tell by the angle of his head that he was listening. She didn't tell them about the envelope. They were 5. They didn't need to carry what was hers to carry. But she sat with them for 20 minutes and let Marco talk about the book. He wasn't really reading and helped Luca figure out why his structure kept collapsing at the 3rd level. A weight distribution issue, she showed him, and watched his face do that thing where the solution clicked. And eventually she put her hand on the glass beside Nico's and looked down at the street with him, at the big black dog walking a morning walker instead of the other way around, dragging the man behind it with cheerful authority. "Where does the dog live?" Nico asked. "Somewhere close," she said. "Does it know where it lives?" "I imagine so." "Then why does it still pull so hard?" he said. "If it knows it's going home, why does it still run?" Evelyn looked at her youngest son, younger than Marco by 4 minutes, younger than Luca by 8, and thought that he was going to be either a philosopher or a problem, and that the difference between the two was mostly a matter of circumstance. "Maybe knowing where home is doesn't make the wanting any quieter," she said. Nico considered this. Then he nodded once, satisfied, and peeled himself away from the window to go demand breakfast. She called Elena from her office on the 2nd floor while the nanny got the boys through their morning routine. Elena Vasquez had been her first hire, 3 months after the triplets were born, when Evelyn had secured her first real consulting contract and realized that she could not simultaneously manage 3 infants, rebuild her professional credibility from the ground up, and maintain any version of her own sanity. Elena was 38, former corporate law, and had the rare quality of understanding exactly what Evelyn needed without requiring extensive explanation. "I got one too," Elena said, before Evelyn could speak. Her voice was flat. "Careful." "Came to the office, same envelope." Evelyn hadn't expected that. She sat back in her chair. "He invited my CFO." "He invited your entire senior leadership team," Elena said. "I've gotten calls from James, from Christine, from David Park. All of them received envelopes this morning. Moretti Foundation Gala, Saturday night." The precision of it was almost admirable. Damien hadn't sent her a private invitation to crawl back into a room where he could humiliate her quietly. He'd cast a wide net. He was going to do whatever he was planning to do publicly, in front of her people, in front of his people, in front of whatever assembled collection of New York money and influence attended the Moretti Foundation's events. "He wants an audience," Evelyn said. "He always does," Elena said. "What do you want to do?" Evelyn looked out the window at the courtyard below, where she could hear the boys at breakfast through the open transom, Marco explaining something at considerable volume, Luca intermittently correcting him, Nico silent in the way that meant he was eating steadily and thinking about something no one had asked him to think about. "I want you to call Dominique at the atelier," Evelyn said. "I need a dress by Friday, and I want the roles detailed. We're going." A pause on Elena's end. Not surprise. Elena was not easily surprised, but calculation. "And the boys?" Evelyn had thought about this during the 3 minutes and 40 seconds at the kitchen window. They come with me. All three. Silence. Evelyn, Elena said finally, you understand what that means? Yes, Evelyn said. I do. She understood exactly what it meant. She had understood it from the moment she looked at the handwriting on the invitation card and felt the particular cold clarity that sometimes came when the thing you had been bracing for, in some deep, cordoned-off part of yourself, finally arrived. Damien Moretti had cast her out of his life on the basis of a lie. She had known it was a lie. She had tried to tell him. He had not let her speak, and then his men had removed her from the estate while Victor Salazar stood in the doorway with his arms folded and an expression she had been too frightened and too heartbroken to correctly read at the time. It had taken her 2 years and the slow grinding work of rebuilding her life, which gave her a great deal of time to think, to understand what she'd seen on Victor's face that night. Not satisfaction, not indifference. Relief. She had been a threat to Victor's position long before she understood what Victor was. She'd seen things, inconsistencies in the financial records she'd been brought in to manage, gaps between what was reported and what she could trace, a pattern of transactions that didn't make sense if the organization was operating the way Damien believed it was. She hadn't had enough yet to confront Damien directly. She'd been building the case carefully, methodically. And then, before she could bring it to him, she was suddenly the one being accused. The evidence had been elegant. She had to grant Victor that. Bank accounts in her name she'd never opened. Communications that bore her digital signature and weren't hers. A timeline that was constructed with enough careful detail that even she, looking at it with the sick certainty of knowing it was fabricated, had felt a moment's vertigo. If she hadn't known the truth, she might have believed it herself. Damien had believed it. He had believed it completely. And he had ended her with the same efficiency he applied to everything he considered a threat to what he'd built. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't cried. He just looked at her with those gray eyes gone to stone and told her she was done. She had not told him she was pregnant. She was 8 weeks along and had not yet found the right moment, and then there was no longer any moment at all. And then she was in the back of a car with $300 and a burner phone and a choice about whether to call him and tell him or disappear entirely. She had chosen to disappear, not from weakness. She wanted that understood. She'd understood it herself at the time, with exhausted, frightened clarity in a motel room in New Jersey, while she figured out what came next. She had chosen to disappear because she was 8 weeks pregnant with the child of a man who had believed she was capable of betraying him without hesitation, without evidence beyond what someone else had constructed, without even asking her to look him in the eye and lie to him. She had chosen to disappear because she did not know what his organization would do to the child of a woman they believed was a traitor. She had chosen to disappear because she was terrified and alone and furious, and because the fury was the only thing clean enough to steer by. She had steered by it for 5 years. Chubb. Carter Capital Management had its offices on the 43rd floor of a building in Midtown that Evelyn had chosen partly for the view and partly because the building's prior tenant had been a competitor whose spectacular collapse she had watched from a distance with professional interest and personal satisfaction. The firm managed $11 billion in assets. It had started with a $60,000 contract with a regional pension fund, and Evelyn working 16-hour days in a studio apartment while a postpartum depression she refused to fully acknowledge pressed down on her like weather. She did not talk about those early months. She had survived them. That was sufficient. What she talked about, when she talked at all, which wasn't often, because she had learned early that in her industry, silence was more valuable than almost any statement you could make, was systems. She thought in systems. She always had. It was why Damien had brought her in initially, 4 years before everything collapsed. He'd needed someone who could look at a sprawling, complex organization and find where the structure was sound and where it was rotting. And she was very good at that. She was also very good at building things that lasted, which was not a skill Damien had ever fully developed, because he had been raised in an environment where longevity was achieved through dominance and the permanent suppression of alternatives. She had built Carter Capital to last. She had built it with the particular attention of someone who knew exactly what a structure looked like when someone was quietly undermining it from within, because she had lived inside that kind of structure and hadn't recognized it until it collapsed on her. The firm's internal controls were meticulous, The legal architecture was constructed by the best attorneys Elena could find. The security systems, both digital and physical, were built by a team that Evelyn had assembled from former intelligence professionals and cybersecurity specialists. And they were not merely defensive. Over the past 3 years, she had been building something else alongside the firm, something quieter. She hadn't had a name for it at first. She thought of it as an insurance policy, which was perhaps underselling it. A network of information, contacts inside financial institutions, regulatory bodies, law enforcement, and 2 foreign intelligence services who found her data management capabilities useful for reasons she didn't ask about. A system for tracking the movement of money through the kinds of channels that didn't appear on any legitimate ledger. She told herself she'd built it for protection. That was true. She told herself she'd built it because she never again wanted to be the person who didn't see it coming. That was also true. She did not examine the third reason too closely, that somewhere in the back of her mind, in the part she kept sealed, she had always known that the accounting she was owed had not yet come. Thursday, she took the boys to their school, a small private school on the Upper East Side where the teachers had been hired partly for their academic credentials, and partly, though Evelyn would not have said so aloud, because each of them had been background checked with a thoroughness that would have alarmed them if they'd known. She walked them to the entrance herself, which she didn't always do. Luca accepted this without comment. Marco used the opportunity to describe in significant detail a dream he'd had about a submarine. Nico held her hand the whole walk without saying anything, which was either because he was tired or because he was thinking, and with Nico she had learned that the difference was mostly academic. At the door she crouched down in front of all 3 of them. "We're going to a party Saturday night," she said. "What kind of party?" Marco immediately wanted to know. "A fancy one, in a big hotel." "With cake?" Marco said. "Probably." "Do we have to be quiet?" Luca asked. He didn't ask if it was going to be fun. He assessed conditions. "You have to be yourselves," Evelyn said. "That's all I want from you. Just be exactly who you are." Nico looked at her. He had the unsettling quality, present since infancy, of seeming to understand entire conversations that hadn't taken place. "Are you nervous?" he said. "No," she said. He tilted his head slightly. He didn't call her a liar because he was 5 and the word hadn't arrived yet, but his expression communicated something adjacent to that assessment. "A little," she said. He nodded. Then he patted her once on the shoulder, solid, deliberate, like someone comforting a large animal, and went inside. Luca followed. Marco went last, still talking about the submarine, and the door closed behind them. Evelyn stood up. She straightened her coat. Behind her, Marcus waited at a respectful distance. She turned and walked back to the car and did not look at her hands to see if they were shaking, because she already knew. The dress arrived Friday afternoon. Dominique had outdone herself, or rather, Dominique had understood the brief with the precision of an artist who had been dressing women for significant occasions for 30 years, and had developed an instinct for what a particular woman needed a particular garment to do. It was midnight blue, floor length. The construction was severe, architectural, the kind of dress that cost a significant amount of money and looked as though it cost significantly more because the design was built around the idea that the body wearing it was the actual point. No embellishment, no flourish, just the cut, which was extraordinary, and the fabric, which moved like dark water. Evelyn put it on Friday evening in her bedroom with the door closed. She stood in front of the full-length mirror and looked at herself for a long time. She was 33 years old. She'd been 28 when she left the Moretti estate in the back of a car, crying so hard she couldn't see the highway, trying to calculate what $300 could cover while simultaneously trying to remember how to breathe. She'd been 28 and she'd had no money, no references she could use, no professional history she could claim without it leading back to a criminal organization, and she'd been pregnant in a way she didn't yet know was 3 times over. She looked at herself now and thought, I did not break. She thought I was supposed to break. She thought, he has no idea what's coming through that door. She took the dress off carefully and hung it up and went to finish helping the boys with the logistics of a bath, which in her household involved a great deal of negotiation, some amount of water on the floor outside the tub, and Marco narrating everything as it occurred in the manner of a sports announcer. Saturday. The preparation took most of the afternoon. Her own, which was deliberate and unhurried, and the boys', which was chaotic in the specific way of getting 3 5-year-olds into dress clothes while they were in various states of cooperation. Luca was cooperative. Marco was cooperative in theory, but kept getting distracted. Nico submitted to the process with quiet dignity and a single brief negotiation about his shoes, which he won on the grounds that the shoes Evelyn had selected were, as he put it, too tight for my personality. By 7:30 they were in the rolls, Marcus driving, Evelyn in the back with 3 small boys in miniature suits sitting in a row beside her with varying degrees of stillness, moving through Saturday night Manhattan traffic toward the Ashford Hotel. "Who's going to be there?" Luca asked. "A lot of people," Evelyn said. "Do you know them?" "Some of them." "Do they know you?" She looked at her eldest son. At the precise architecture of his face, the steady quality of his attention. "They're about to," she said. Luca considered this. Then he went back to looking out the window at the passing city with the calm of someone who had assessed the situation and found it manageable. Marco fell asleep 6 blocks from the hotel, which was both predictable and impressive, and had to be gently woken when the car slowed. Nico did not sleep. He sat with his hands folded in his lap and watched the city and didn't speak. And when the rolls pulled up to the Ashfords' entrance and the lights of the hotel fell across his face, his gray eyes picked up the reflection and held it. The Ashfords' grand ballroom could seat 400 people. Tonight it held 360. Evelyn's intelligence on the guest list had been thorough, and it was full of the particular density of money and influence that gathered in rooms like this. The sound of very expensive things happening at middle volume, the smell of flowers and alcohol, and the specific cologne favored by men who believed the right fragrance conferred authority. She waited in the anteroom for 4 minutes, not because she was uncertain, because she understood timing the way she understood everything else, structure and patience, and the exact moment when action produces maximum effect. The doors to the ballroom were 12 feet high, gilded, the kind of doors that opened inward and required 2 staff members to manage them properly. She'd confirmed this earlier. She'd confirmed a lot of things. She looked at her sons one more time. They looked back at her. Marco had a small smudge of something, she didn't want to know what, on his left cuff that she'd missed. She smoothed it with her thumb. He held still. She straightened Luca's collar. Nico didn't require adjustment. Nico had somehow remained pristine throughout the entire evening by some mechanism she couldn't fully account for. "Ready?" she said. "I was ready before," Nico said. She almost smiled. "Yes," she said. "You were." She nodded to the attendants. The doors opened. She had thought about this moment many times. In the bad years, she'd thought about it as a fantasy, the version where she came back with power and the power made him sorry. In the better years, she'd thought about it more clearly, stripped of the fantasy, and what she'd understood was that the goal was not to make him sorry. Sorry was for small grievances. What had happened between them was not small. The goal was to be undeniable, to walk into the room that was supposed to be his and take up space in it so completely that everything he'd believed about her, everything he'd been made to believe, had to reckon with the living fact of her. The sound in the ballroom did not stop all at once. It died the way sound dies in certain large spaces, progressively, from the nearest point to the farthest, conversation dropping in a wave as people turned to look. She walked in. She did not hurry. She did not look around the room in the way of someone looking for approval or orientation. She moved with the particular quality that she'd had to learn, consciously, deliberately, in the second year when she'd started building the firm and realized that every room she walked into was a negotiation, the quality of someone who had already decided that the space belongs to them and is simply moving through it. Midnight blue dress, dark hair up, clean lines, no excess. Heels that were the precise height of someone who has thought carefully about practical power and dismissed the theatrical version. The diamond earrings were the only jewelry, and they were real, and they were not ostentatious, just present. Beside her, 3 small boys in matching dark suits. Gray eyes that swept the room with 3 different modes of attention. Luca cataloging, Marco delighted, Nico reading. The wave of silence reached the far end of the ballroom and broke. She heard it from somewhere in the crowd. A single sharp intake of breath that was nothing by itself but somehow catalyzed the whole room, and then the whisper started, low and urgent, a current moving through 360 people who were all doing the same arithmetic at the same moment. 5 years. 3 boys. Those eyes. She kept walking toward the center of the room. She did not look for him. She didn't need to. She could feel the exact location of Damien Moretti, the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure, something physical, registered below the level of thought. She had hated that she still had that. She had tried, over 5 years, to convince herself that it was gone. It wasn't gone. She stopped at the center of the ballroom where the chandelier light was strongest, where she was visible from every point in the room, and she stood still. And then she let herself look. He was across the room, maybe 50 feet away, standing near the bar with 3 of his senior people around him. He was wearing a black suit that was almost certainly Italian, cut to a body that was still the body she remembered, broader now through the shoulders, the jaw sharper, the gray threading at his temples that hadn't been there 5 years ago. He was 41 now. He wore it the way he wore everything, without apparent awareness that it existed. He had already seen her. He'd seen her the moment the doors opened, she realized. His stillness had the quality of someone who had been watching a door and then been given something he did not know how to categorize. His gaze moved to the boys. She watched it happen, watched it land, watched the exact moment when Damien Moretti, who had survived 3 decades inside an organization that ran on violence and precision, who had buried men he'd grown up with and built an empire over their graves, who had not been visibly shaken by anything she had ever witnessed, went still in a way that was entirely different from his usual stillness. This was not control. This was a man encountering something that had detonated inside his chest and was trying not to let it reach his face. He was failing. Across 50 feet of marble floor and 358 witnesses, his gray eyes, the exact gray of her son's eyes, the same weight, the same depth, found hers. Evelyn did not look away. She had not come here to look away. She held his gaze, and she let him see it, all of it, everything she had not been allowed to say 5 years ago, everything she had built in the time he'd spent not knowing, all of it present in the simple fact of her standing here alive and intact with 3 children who had his face. Then, slowly, she turned away. "Mom," Marco said at her elbow, "I can see the dessert table from here. Can we—" "Not yet," she said. "But—" "Not yet, Marco." She accepted a glass of water from a passing server and turned to speak to Elena, who had materialized at her left shoulder with the timing of someone who had anticipated this moment with professional precision. Behind her, she could hear the room beginning to knit itself back together, conversation resuming, though at a higher, more urgent register than before. The arithmetic being done, the calculations being made. Every person in this room who had ever known Damien Moretti's face was now standing in a ballroom with its answer multiplied by 3 and dressed in small dark suits, and the implications of that arithmetic were spreading through the crowd like heat. She took a sip of water. Her hand was steady. Across the room she heard one of Damien's people say something, low, urgent, and then the sound of his voice, just the tone of it, not the words, cutting through the ambient noise of the ballroom. She knew that tone. She had heard it used to end conversations, end negotiations, end certain relationships between men who'd thought themselves untouchable. She had not heard it used in 5 years, and it still landed somewhere in her chest like a thumb pressed against an old bruise. She did not turn around. From her left, Elena leaned close. "His consigliere is watching you," Elena said quietly. "Victor Salazar. He's at the northeast corner. He's been watching since the doors opened." Evelyn already knew this. She had felt it, a different quality of attention from a different source, from someone who was running different calculations than Damien was running. Not grief, not shock. Something measuring, something urgent. "I know," Evelyn said. "He looks afraid," Elena said. Evelyn set her water glass down on the nearest table. She kept her voice entirely even. "He should be," she said. And across the room, moving through the parted crowd with the particular contained velocity of a man who has decided that whatever comes next, he is done standing still, Damien Moretti was walking toward her. He crossed the room the way he moved through everything, without asking permission from the space around him, without adjusting his pace for the crowd that parted ahead of him, without any visible acknowledgement that what he was doing was anything other than exactly what he intended. The people nearest him stepped back, not because he asked them to, but because something in his bearing communicated that the alternative was inadvisable. Evelyn watched him come. She did not step back. She did not step forward. She stood where she was with her water glass set aside and her hands loose at her sides, and let him cover the distance while the room held its collective breath and pretended not to. He stopped 4 feet away. She'd expected closer. Damien had always used proximity as a tool, the way big men sometimes did, the casual weaponization of physical space. But he stopped at 4 feet and just looked at her, and the distance felt deliberate, like he didn't trust himself closer, like the extra feet were the only thing keeping something contained. "Evelyn," he said. One word. Her name in his mouth after 5 years sounded like something dug up from ground that was supposed to stay sealed. "Damien," she said. His jaw was tight. The muscle in his cheek moved once. His eyes had already gone to the boys. She could see it, the way his attention kept splitting, unable to stay on her face without being pulled back to 3 small faces that were, in the most undeniable possible way, a mirror of his own. Marco was looking at Damien with frank curiosity, the way he looked at everything that interested him, openly, without self-consciousness. Luca had positioned himself slightly in front of his brothers, which he always did when he was uncertain about a situation, an instinct so old and consistent that Evelyn had stopped trying to understand where it had come from. Nico was watching Damien with an expression that was entirely unreadable, which was Nico's most unsettling mode and one that Evelyn had learned meant he was processing something significant. "We need to talk," Damien said. "We're talking," she said. "Privately." "No." The word landed flat and final, and she watched it hit him, watched the slight flare at his nostrils, the controlled exhale. He was accustomed to the word no arriving with negotiation attached. She was not offering negotiation. "Evelyn." His voice dropped. Not softer, lower, the register he used when he was working to maintain a control that was under genuine pressure. "Those children are mine," she said. "Everything about them is mine. Their names, their schools, their routines, their lives. All of it. Mine." "Their eyes," he said. She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "Their eyes." Something moved across his face that she didn't have a clean name for. Not grief exactly. Something rawer than that. Something that hadn't had enough time yet to become a recognizable emotion because the information was still too new, still detonating in layers. "How old?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. 5, she said. He did the math. She watched him do it. Watched the exact moment the timeline resolved and what it meant arrived. That she had been pregnant when she left. That she had been carrying his children when his men put her in that car, that she had been 8 weeks along and had said nothing and he had not given her any reason to. His hands, at his sides, closed briefly into fists, opened again. "You should have told me," he said. "You should have let me speak," she said. The silence between them was dense with everything that had already been said and everything that couldn't be said here, in a ballroom with 358 people consuming this moment with the hungry discretion of people who understood they were witnessing something that would be discussed for years. From her peripheral vision, she caught Victor Salazar moving along the northeast wall, still keeping distance, still watching. The calculation on his face had shifted. The fear Elena had identified had sharpened into something more active. "I want to understand," Damien said. "I want to hear what you had 5 years to want that," Evelyn said. Her voice was even. It cost her something to keep it even, but she kept it. "The wanting didn't arrive until I walked through your door." His jaw worked. He looked at the boys again, couldn't stop looking at them, she realized, and there was something in that she refused to let herself feel anything about right now because she needed everything she had for this room in this moment. Marco, who had the social instincts of someone who had grown up in a household where his mother took meetings and his mother's colleagues sometimes came for dinner, and the thing to do in those situations was be charming and direct, looked up at Damien and said, "You have the same eyes as us." The room, or the portion of it closest to them, went briefly, perfectly still. Damien looked down at Marco. Something in his face changed in a way that had nothing to do with control or strategy or the particular armor he'd built over 41 years of surviving. He looked at Marco, and for just a moment, he looked like a man who had been handed something extraordinary and was terrified of dropping it. "I do," he said. His voice came out rough. "That's weird," Marco said, with the cheerful pragmatism of a child who has identified a fact and reported it. "Mom's eyes are brown." "Marco," Luca said quietly. "What?" "They are." Evelyn put her hand on Marco's shoulder. "Go with Elena," she said. "She'll take you to find the dessert table." Marco lit up immediately. The previous conversation evaporated in the face of the dessert table's superior claim on his attention. He went. Luca hesitated, looked at Evelyn, looked at Damien, looked back at Evelyn with an assessment she could almost read word for word, and then followed his brother. Elena materialized smoothly, shepherding both of them away. Nico didn't move. He looked at Damien for another 3 seconds with that unreadable expression. Then he looked at Evelyn. Then he took her hand, not in the way of a child asking for reassurance, but in the way of someone making a deliberate statement of alignment, and stood beside her. Damien looked at Nico's hand and Evelyn's, and his throat moved. "Can we go somewhere quieter?" he said. Not a question this time, not a demand. Something in between, with the edges sanded off in a way she hadn't heard from him before. She thought about it for exactly as long as she needed to. 10 minutes, she said. The East Terrace. Nico stays with Marcus. The East Terrace was a long stone balcony off the ballroom's east corridor, open to the November air and largely empty because November in Manhattan at 8 in the evening was not inviting. 2 space heaters at either end did something minimal about the temperature. A thin stream of cigarette smoke from a man at the far end who moved discreetly away when Damien appeared. They stood at the stone railing. The city was below them, lit and moving, indifferent to what happened on the 43rd floor of the Ashford Hotel, the way cities are always indifferent, which Evelyn had once found depressing and had come to find clarifying. "Talk," she said, because she had given him 10 minutes and he had gotten them, and it was his turn. "Victor told me," he started. "I know what Victor told you." He stopped. "You knew it was him." "I've known for 3 years," she said. "I spent the first 2 just surviving. The third one I spent building what I needed to build." She paused. "I know about the accounts, Damien, the ones he's been running under subsidiary structures that don't appear on any ledger your internal accountants review. I know about the agreements he made with the Sorrento family in 2022 without your authorization. I know about the port contracts, and I know where the money from those contracts actually goes." He was very still. The kind of still that with Damien had always meant he was running calculations faster than he could speak. "You've been building a case," he said. "I've been building insurance," she said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Insurance you never have to use," she said. "If everything stays quiet, if nothing forces your hand." He turned to look at her fully. The terrace light was cold, and it caught his face without any softness, and she could see the years on it, not badly, just honestly, and beneath the years the same person she had known, and the particular weight that came with whatever he was carrying tonight. "He set you up," Damien said. It wasn't a question either, just a man arriving at a destination he should have reached years ago and hating the length of the road. "He set me up," she said. "I was getting too close to what he was doing. Another few weeks and I would have had enough to bring to you. He moved first." The silence ran long. Below them the city moved. Somewhere in the ballroom behind them, 358 people were consuming an evening that had been comprehensively derailed from whatever Damien had originally planned for it. "What did he plan?" she said. "Tonight. What was this supposed to be?" Damien's jaw tightened. He looked back at the city. "He suggested it," he said quietly. "The invitation. He said it would be..." He stopped. "He called it resolution. For the organization. Show the family that the past was closed, that whatever you'd done couldn't touch us." "He wanted you to humiliate me," she said, "in front of your people and mine. And while everyone was watching that, he was going to..." "What? What's moving tonight, Damien?" He looked at her sharply. I've been watching your organization for 3 years, she said. I watched the money, and in the last 6 weeks, something has shifted. Funds moving in patterns I haven't seen before. Positions being established. The kind of thing you do before a significant restructuring. She held his gaze. Or a transfer of control. The air between them changed. She felt it, the specific drop in temperature that had nothing to do with November. He's making a move, Damien said. And it came out quiet, the way the most dangerous things sometimes did. All the volume stripped away until only the weight remained. Tonight? Evelyn said. I think it's tonight. The gala was the distraction. You focused on me walking through the door and he's... She stopped. Listened. Below them, and through the glass doors behind them, she could hear the tone of the ballroom shifting. Not panic. Not yet. Something earlier than panic. The specific quality of a large crowd when something has changed in the room, but no one is certain yet what it is. Damien had heard it too. She saw it in the way his head came up, the way his body reoriented, years of survival instinct. She recognized it because she'd watched it operate for 4 years before everything fell apart. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Whatever he read there made his face go to stone in a way that was different from the stone of control. This was the stone of a man who has just received information that confirms a threat he'd hoped he was wrong about. My men at the east entrance, he said. Someone cut the security feeds 20 minutes ago. The backup system didn't engage. Evelyn had already pulled out her own phone. She had a text from Marcus, sent 40 seconds ago. 3 unregistered vehicles in the service bay. Staff credentials don't check. Your call. She typed back. Lock down the boys. East Corridor, room 4312. Use the secondary key. Don't move until I say. She looked up at Damien. How many of the people in that room are yours? 40, maybe 45. How many of those are actually yours, she said. Not the organization's. Yours personally. The ones you know. His mouth thinned. He understood the distinction immediately, and the fact that he had to think about it told her something he probably didn't want her to know. 15, he said. Reliably. I have 12, she said. Distributed through the ballroom. My security team. They've been there since 6 o'clock. He stared at her. I told you, she said. Insurance. He looked at her for a long moment, this woman he had thrown away, who had built something formidable in the time he'd spent not knowing what he'd destroyed, who was standing on a cold terrace with the city below them telling him she had people in his ballroom, and something passed across his face that she didn't let herself examine. What do you need from me? He said. I need you to go back in that room and act like nothing has changed, she said. Talk to your people. Keep Salazar's attention on you. Don't look at him like you know. And you. I need 5 minutes and my phone, she said. He held her gaze. Then he nodded once, the way he'd always agreed to things he'd assessed as necessary. No performance, no qualification. He straightened his jacket and moved toward the glass doors. Damien, she said. He stopped. Whatever you thought you were going to do tonight, she said. Whatever Victor told you to expect from me. That's over. We're past it. Do you understand? He turned back enough to look at her over his shoulder. His gray eyes in the cold light were exactly the eyes she saw every morning over breakfast, multiplied by 3, and she had spent 5 years building walls between what that meant and what she allowed herself to feel, and those walls were under considerable pressure tonight. I understand, he said, and went inside. Evelyn turned back to the city. She had 4 minutes and 20 seconds before she needed to be back in that room. She opened the secondary app on her phone, the one that her head of intelligence, a former NSA analyst named Reyes, who had come to work for her in year 3 for reasons he'd never fully explained, had built for exactly this kind of situation. She pulled up the building schematic, the financial records she'd been holding, the communications intercepts, legal, technically, by means she didn't fully disclose to her attorneys, that traced the last 6 weeks of Victor Salazar's private correspondence. Then she made 3 calls, the first to Reyes, the second to the head of her security team inside the ballroom, the third to a number she had never used and had hoped she would never need to use, which connected to a man at a federal agency who had been extremely interested for the past 14 months in the particular pattern of financial crime she had documented inside the Moretti organization's subsidiary structures. She kept each call under 90 seconds. She said what needed to be said. She didn't repeat herself. Then she put the phone away and went back through the glass doors into the corridor, where the carpet was deep red and the light was warm and the sound of the ballroom, already shifting, already moving toward something, pressed against the walls around her. Victor Salazar was standing in the corridor, not by coincidence. He had positioned himself between her and the ballroom entrance with the specific deliberateness of someone who had decided that the time for watching from the northeast corner was over. He was in his late 50s, compact, with the kind of even features that photographed well, and the particular careful grooming of a man who understood that presentation was a form of argument. He had been with the Moretti organization for 22 years. He had been at Damien's right hand for 11. He had a glass of champagne in his right hand that he was not drinking. "Miss Carter," he said. "Pleasant. Even. What a remarkable evening." "Victor," she said. "I didn't expect you to actually come," he said. I'll confess it, I thought the invitation might be too much, that you'd understand what it meant and choose to stay away." "And what did it mean?" He smiled. It was a very good smile, warm, practiced, the kind that arrived in the eyes convincingly enough that you almost forgot it had been constructed. "A chance to close a chapter," he said. "Peacefully. Walk away from whatever you've been building with your—" He glanced toward where the boys had gone. "Your family. Take your money. Take your firm. Go somewhere comfortable." "And in exchange," she said. "In exchange," he said, "for what I've built remaining intact." She looked at him. At the careful pleasantness of his face, the glass he wasn't drinking from, the way he was positioned in the corridor. She thought about a doorway 5 years ago, and a man with his arms folded, and an expression she had spent 2 years correctly identifying as relief. "Victor," she said, "I have your financial records, all of them, every account, every transaction, every name. I have your communications from the last 2 years, and I have statements from 3 people inside your operation who have been cooperating with federal investigators for the past 8 months." The pleasant expression didn't fall. It adjusted, a slight hardening at the edges, a recalibration behind the eyes. "You're bluffing," he said. "I don't bluff," she said. I build cases. I've been building this one for 3 years." She took one step toward him, not aggressive, just closing distance enough that she could keep her voice low. "Whatever you have in motion tonight, the vehicles in the service bay, the security feeds you cut, whatever you think you're taking, it's over. It was over before you walked into this corridor." For just a moment, half a second, less, something broke through the even surface of Victor Salazar's face, something old and cold and genuinely frightened. Then it was gone, replaced by the careful pleasantness, and he lifted the champagne glass and finally drank from it. "We'll see," he said. "Yes," she said. "We will." She walked past him into the ballroom, and behind her she heard him set the empty glass down on a corridor table with a precise, deliberate click, and she heard him make a call, 2 words only, and the words were, "It's time." She heard the first sound 40 seconds after she walked back into the ballroom. It wasn't loud. That was the thing about the beginning of something violent in an enclosed space. It didn't announce itself the way movies suggested. It started small. A commotion near the service entrance on the ballroom's west side. The kind of sound that a crowd first processes as an accident. Something dropped. Something broken. The ordinary percussion of a large catered event. People near the west wall turned to look with the mild curiosity of the well-dressed and well-fed. Then the second sound came, and that one nobody misread. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a door hitting a wall with enough force to shake the frame, and then 4 men in staff uniforms were inside the ballroom, and they were not staff, and the things in their hands were not trays, and the crowd understood all of this in approximately 1 second, and the ballroom went from 358 people at a social event to 358 people in a crisis, and the sound that produced was enormous. Evelyn was already moving. Not toward the exits. Everyone was moving toward the exits, which meant the exits were going to be compressed and slow, and exactly where Victor's people would expect the crowd to go. She moved laterally along the east wall toward the corridor that led to the hotel's interior stairwell. She had memorized the building's layout on Thursday. She had walked it herself on Friday afternoon under the pretext of meeting with the hotel's events coordinator about accessibility arrangements for her sons. She pulled out her phone, typed to Marcus. Status. The reply came in 8 seconds. Boys secure. Room 4312, two of mine outside the door. Where are you? She typed, moving to stairwell B. Stay put. Don't open the door for anyone who isn't me or Elena. She reached the corridor. Behind her, the ballroom noise was escalating, shouting now, the specific high pitch of panic, and underneath it something she recognized from a period of her life she didn't discuss, the sound of men moving with purpose through a disordered space. Victor had planned this carefully. The gala had always been the container, the crowd, the noise, the distraction of Evelyn's arrival, all of it cover for whatever transfer of power he was executing tonight. She had known this. She had prepared for this. What she had not fully anticipated was the scale of it. 4 men visible in the ballroom meant more outside it, more in the service corridors, more in the building's infrastructure, doing things she couldn't yet see. Her phone buzzed. Reyes. She took the call moving. Talk, she said. We have a problem. Reyes's voice was flat and precise, the voice of someone who had spent years delivering bad information and had built a particular tone for it. The federal contact, Harmon. What about him? He's not answering. His office says he's been unreachable since this afternoon. They're running a check, but it's a pause. Evelyn. His supervisor is saying his credentials were suspended 2 days ago, pending investigation. She stopped walking 1 second, then she started again. What kind of investigation? She said, but they're not saying, but the subpoenas we filed through his office, the ones that were supposed to, they didn't go through, she said. They went through his office, Reyes said, which means if his credentials were already compromised, then whoever is investigating him may have. Victor knew, she said. He knew about Harmon. The corridor was empty, fluorescent light, the sound of the ballroom muffled but not distant enough. How much did Harmon have? Reyes said. She ran the inventory in her head with the quick, cold precision of someone who had built the file piece by piece over 3 years and knew every component. The subsidiary account records, the port contract documentation, the communications intercepts from the last 18 months. She paused. The witness statements. Silence on Reyes's end. Then, if Salazar has someone inside the federal structure, he's had Harmon for at least 2 days, she said. Maybe longer. She thought about the timeline, the invitation arriving Tuesday, the gala scheduled for Saturday. He's known I was coming, he knew what I'd built, and he found the thread, and he pulled it before I could use it. The financial records, Reyes said. The ones in the secondary system. Those went through a different channel. Are they intact? Yes, but without the witness statements and the federal cooperation, what we have is, it's a civil case at best. It's not enough to, I know what it's not enough for, she said. She stopped at the stairwell door, pressed her back against the wall beside it, and looked both directions down the corridor. Empty. The sound from the ballroom above had changed again. She could hear it through the ceiling now, movement, the specific cadence of people being directed. Victor's men establishing control of the space. She had 3 years of work, and she had just lost the piece that made it prosecutable. She had insurance, and the insurance had been found and cut before she could collect on it. She was standing in a corridor in a midnight blue dress with her phone in her hand and her sons 4 floors above her. And she had just watched the plan she'd spent 3 years building lose its structural center. She did not panic. She had learned, in the second year when money was genuinely frightening and the firm was not yet stable and she was running on 4 hours of sleep and something close to pure will, what panic actually felt like, the way it narrowed the field of vision, the way it made sound seem like it was coming through water. She had learned to recognize the first signal of it and redirect. She redirected now. What do we have that's clean, she said, independent of Harmon's chain? What can't be touched? The financial records in the secondary system, Reyes said. The account structures. The transaction history. He paused. The recording. She had almost forgotten the recording. 3 months ago, a meeting she hadn't been present for, but that one of her contacts inside the Moretti organization's outer structure had been. A contact who had understood that what he was hearing was significant and had had the presence of mind to capture it on a device the size of a shirt button. 47 minutes of audio that included Victor Salazar laying out, in specific operational detail, the structure of the fraud he'd been running inside the Moretti organization for 6 years. Not for Evelyn's benefit, he hadn't known the recording existed. For the benefit of 2 men he was bringing into the operation. "The recording is clean," she said. "It's clean," Reyes confirmed. "It was never in Harmon's files. It was never part of the federal package." "Can you get it into this building?" A pause. "What do you mean?" "I mean, can you transmit it to a system inside the Ashford Hotel within the next—" She checked her watch. 20 minutes. "Evelyn, the building's internal network is—" "The audiovisual system," she said. "The ballroom. They have a presentation system they use for gala events, speeches, slideshows. It runs off a dedicated server that has an external access port for the hotel's AV contractor." She had also learned this on Friday. "Can you find it?" A longer pause, the sound of Reyes typing. "Give me 12 minutes, he said. "You have 10, she said, and ended the call. She pushed through the stairwell door, She heard them before she saw them, 2 men on the landing below her, moving up, not running, but moving with the specific unhurried efficiency of people who knew where they were going and were not expecting resistance. She had 2 seconds before they rounded the landing and saw her. She went up instead of down. 3rd floor landing, then 4th, the dress making the stairs harder than she would have liked, the heels making them harder still. She pulled the heels off on the 3rd floor landing, left them against the wall, and covered the last flight in bare feet on cold concrete. She pushed through the 4th floor door and moved fast down the corridor toward room 4312. Marcus was outside the door, one of his men beside him, Santos, who had been with the security team for 2 years, and who was built like a consequence. Marcus took one look at her face, and his expression, which was already serious, tightened into something more specific. "How many in the building?" he said. "At least 8 that I've confirmed, probably more." She was already pulling out her phone. "The boys." "Inside. Elena's with them. Nico's asleep somehow. Marco is eating something he found in the minibar. Luca is sitting by the door." He paused. "He asked me twice what's happening." "He always does," she said. She needed to go back downstairs. She knew this. She also knew that what she needed to do required her to be in the ballroom, in front of people, with the recording and the financial documentation, and enough of Victor's inner circle present to make what she had irrefutable, not legally, not tonight, but publicly, in the way that mattered for the next 48 hours while the legal architecture was rebuilt. She needed Damien. She texted him, "Stairwell B, 4th floor, 2 minutes. Come alone." She did not know if his phone was still with him. She did not know if he was in a position to respond. She stood in the corridor outside room 4312 and waited. The corridor was quiet, and from somewhere 2 floors below she heard the muffled sound of something heavy being moved. 40 seconds later her phone buzzed. "Coming." He arrived in 90 seconds, which meant he'd run. He came through the stairwell door breathing harder than he would have wanted her to see, and with a cut above his left eyebrow that was bleeding in a thin line down toward his cheekbone. His jacket was gone. His shirt was still white, but the collar was open, and something about the knuckles on his right hand suggested the jacket's absence was recent and not voluntary. "You're bleeding," she said. "I know," he said. "Talk." "Harmon is compromised. The federal cooperation is gone. Victor got to him before tonight. The witness statements, the subpoenas, all of it is burned." She watched his face process this. "But I have a recording. 47 minutes, Victor explaining the entire fraud operation in his own words to 2 of his people. Reyes is transmitting it to the ballroom's AV system in..." She checked her watch. 6 minutes, if he finds the access port. "And if he does," Damien said. His voice was steady. The breathing was evening out. "Then I need to get that recording played in that ballroom in front of your entire inner circle. Every captain, every consigliere, every man who thinks Victor Salazar is the future of this organization." "Victor controls the room right now," Damien said. "He has men on every exit, and 3 of his people have positioned themselves with my captains. It's a clean move. He's not threatening anyone openly, just reorganizing the geometry," she said. "Yes, it's how he works. He doesn't make it look like a coup until it already is one." She looked at the cut above his eyebrow. "Who did that?" "One of his men, in the corridor near the bar." His jaw tightened. "I handled it." "How many of your 15 do you still have access to?" 9. The other 6 are in positions Victor's people are watching. 9 in my 12, she said. "That's enough for what I need if the timing is right." She thought for 1 second. "There's a presentation podium at the north end of the ballroom. The hotel's AV system feeds through speakers mounted in the ceiling. It's not possible to shut them down quickly without going to the server room on the basement level. If Reyes gets the file in and I can get to that podium—" "Victor will move to stop you before you finish a sentence," Damien said. "I know," she said, "which is why I need you to give me 60 seconds. He looked at her. The corridor light was fluorescent, and it was not kind, and she could see everything on his face that he wasn't managing to hide. The cut, the anger underneath the control, and beneath that something older and more complicated that had been there since she'd walked through the ballroom doors, and that he hadn't had time to deal with and might not have time to deal with for a while yet. 60 seconds, he said. "Starting from when I reached the podium. I need 60 seconds where Victor's attention is entirely on you and not on what's coming through the speakers." He thought about it for less than 5 seconds. "I can do that," he said. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to tell him the truth," Damien said. "That I know what he did. That I've known all evening." Something cold came into his eyes. The specific cold she remembered from 4 years of watching him operate. The temperature he reached when something had been decided and only the execution remained. "He'll want to correct me. He'll want to control the narrative in front of the organization. He won't be able to help himself." "Because he's done it for 22 years, she said. "Because he's done it for 22 years, Damien agreed, "and it's worked every time." She looked at him. At this man she had loved and lost and spent 5 years building walls against, standing in a fluorescent corridor with blood on his face, agreeing to walk back into a room where his consigliere of 11 years was executing a coup against him, buying her 60 seconds. "Don't get shot," she said. "Working on it," he said, and turned back to the stairwell. The ballroom had been reconfigured in the time she'd been gone. Not physically. The tables were where they'd been. The flowers were still upright. The chandelier still threw its warm light across everything. But the architecture of people had changed. Victor's men were distributed through the space with the specific casualness of people trying to look like guests while occupying positions that controlled sightlines and exits. The crowd had been compressed toward the center of the room, not forcibly, just through the steady pressure of men who positioned themselves between people and the places people wanted to go. Victor was at the north end of the room, near the presentation podium, talking to 2 of Damien's captains with the relaxed authority of someone who has already won and is simply allowing the room to understand it. Evelyn came in through the east corridor entrance. She walked without rushing, without looking at Victor, moving through the crowd the way she'd moved through it 2 hours ago, with the particular quality of someone who has decided the space belongs to her. People moved aside. Some of them recognized her. Some of them were too frightened to do anything other than follow the easiest path through the room. Her phone vibrated once. A text from Reyes. "In. File is loaded. Ready on your signal." She kept walking toward the north end of the room. She heard Damien's voice before she saw him. He'd come in from a different entrance, the west, and he was speaking at a volume calibrated for Victor specifically, but loud enough to carry to the captain standing nearby. She couldn't make out the words yet, but she could hear the tone, and the tone was the one she'd identified on the terrace. Stripped down, all the performance removed, just the weight. Victor's head came up. His attention moved to Damien. The careful pleasantness recalibrated again, this time toward something more alert. Evelyn reached the podium. She was 15 feet from Victor. His eyes found her for one fraction of a second. She saw it, the split of his attention. And then Damien said something that pulled him back, and she heard it now because she was close enough. "Tell them what you told me in 2019, about what the organization needed. Tell them what you told me about loyalty." Victor's jaw tightened. Damien had found exactly the right lever. The public invocation, in front of the captains, of a conversation that Victor had used to position himself, to build his own credibility by advising Damien. He couldn't ignore it. Not here. Not with these people watching. Damien, Victor said, and his voice was still even, still pleasant, a man dealing patiently with an inconvenience. This isn't the time or place for... I think it's exactly the time, Damien said. I think this is the best possible time, with everyone who matters to this organization standing in this room. Evelyn leaned to the podium's microphone. She pressed the button Reyes had told her to press. She said quietly into the mic, "Play it." For 2 seconds, nothing happened. The crowd murmur continued. Victor was still looking at Damien, still managing the performance. Then the speakers in the ceiling came alive. Victor Salazar's voice filled the ballroom. Not the voice he used in public, not the pleasant, managed, carefully calibrated voice that had been operating in this room all evening. The other voice. The one she'd heard on 47 minutes of audio recorded 3 months ago in a room Victor had believed was private. Precise, unguarded, detailed, laying out in operational specificity exactly what he had built inside the Moretti organization and exactly how he had built it and exactly who had been in his way and what he had done about them. The ballroom went still. Victor moved. She had expected this, the moment recognition arrived on his face, which it did in under 3 seconds. He moved toward the podium with a directness that discarded all the careful pleasantness entirely. 2 of his men moved with him. Damien stepped into his path. Not his people. Damien himself, physically, 4 feet between Victor and the podium. The cut above his eye was still bleeding, and he was in a corridor-rumpled shirt with no jacket, and he had never in Evelyn's experience looked more like what he actually was than he did in that moment. "Don't," Damien said. "You have no idea what you're doing," Victor said. The pleasantness was completely gone now. What was underneath it was older and harder. "You have no idea what I've protected you from, what I've managed for you for 22 years while I what?" Damien said. Quiet. No heat in it, which was worse than heat. "While you made decisions based on emotion," Victor said. "While you led a woman into this organization who was telling the truth," Damien said, "that you fabricated every piece of it." Victor's men had stopped moving. They were watching Victor now, not Evelyn. Around the room, Damien's 9 were repositioning. She could see Marcus's team doing the same from the other direction. The geometry of the room shifting again, this time away from Victor. And the recording kept playing. 47 minutes. Victor's voice in the ceiling, naming accounts, naming amounts, naming the people he had used and the people he had removed, and the particular mechanical detail of how you dismantle a man's trust in the person beside him. When you need them both neutralized and you only have one accusation to work with. It was the part about Evelyn that broke what remained of the room's composure. She heard it from the speakers, heard her own name in Victor's voice, heard the specific language he'd used to describe what he'd done and why and how he'd known it would work, because Damien had a weakness, and the weakness was that he trusted completely and therefore broke completely, and Victor had simply found the right pressure point and applied it at the right moment, clinical, efficient, final. And she watched 320 people who had not known this hear it for the first time. She watched Damien hear it. She had heard the recording before. She had listened to it alone, in her office, at 11 o'clock at night 3 months ago when Reyes had first brought it to her, and she had sat with it for a long time afterward before she was capable of proceeding with anything else. But she had not been in the same room as Damien when he heard it. She watched his face. She watched the moment the specific language landed, Victor's voice describing Evelyn Carter as a mechanism, a tool for leverage, the most efficient way to remove 2 problems at once, because the man is easiest to break through what he loves, and she was already positioned to find the discrepancy anyway, so better to move first. And she watched Damien absorb it. He didn't move. He stood exactly where he was between Victor and the podium, and he absorbed it, and his face did something she had no word for, something that moved beneath the surface and stayed there, contained by the same discipline that had kept him standing in a ballroom with a coup in progress and blood on his face, but visible if you were looking. She was looking. Victor made his move in the silence after that section of the recording played. Not toward the podium this time. He had reassessed, and he was fast, Victor. He had always been fast. It was one of the things that had made him effective for 22 years. He moved toward the nearest exit, the east corridor, the way out, the calculation being that the room was lost, and the next move was to reach whatever assets he had outside this building, before the night closed entirely around him. He made it 6 feet. Damien caught him by the shoulder and turned him, and what followed was not elegant. It was fast and brutal, and it covered about 4 seconds, and at the end of it, Victor Salazar was on the ballroom floor with Damien's knee on his chest, and one of Damien's captains was already on his phone, and 2 of Evelyn's security team were at the east corridor door. The recording kept playing. Evelyn stood at the podium. The room was very quiet now, the specific quiet of people who have witnessed something they will not be able to unwitness. She looked at the assembled inner circle of the Moretti organization, captains, advisors, associates, the people who had built their positions and their safety around a structure that the voice in the ceiling was methodically dismantling, and she understood that she was looking at the moment before everything changed. Then her phone lit up with a call from a number she didn't recognize, and she answered it because the area code was federal, and the voice on the other end was not Harmon. "Ms. Carter," the voice said, "my name is Deputy Director Sandra Okafor. I understand you have a recording you've been trying to get to us." Evelyn looked across the ballroom at Damien, who was standing now, Victor's collar in his fist, chest still working from the effort, eyes finding hers across 30 feet of marble floor, an overturned evening, and the wreckage of 22 years of careful, patient betrayal. "I do," Evelyn said into the phone, "and I have the man it describes standing in front of me." "Don't let him leave the building," Okafor said. "That," Evelyn said, "is already handled." The federal vehicles arrived 11 minutes after Evelyn ended the call with Okafor. She knew this because she was counting. She counted the way she counted everything under pressure, not obsessively, not as a coping mechanism, but because time was the only resource in a crisis that couldn't be managed, only tracked, and knowing exactly how much of it had passed, told her how much remained before the situation either resolved or became something else entirely. In those 11 minutes, a great deal happened. Victor's 2 men inside the ballroom made a coordinated move toward the east exit at the 4-minute mark, which suggested they had a signal from someone outside the building or a timer they'd agreed on in advance. Damien's captain, a compact Sicilian-American named Caruso, who had been with the organization since before Damien took over, and who moved with the efficiency of someone who had been in worse situations and was not impressed by this one, cut them off before they reached the corridor. There was a brief, ugly scuffle near the east wall that knocked over a table and sent glassware across the marble in a bright cascade of sound. Nobody fired a weapon. This was either because nobody wanted to discharge a firearm in a room with 320 civilians, or because the calculation of what federal investigators would make of ballistic evidence had been reached simultaneously by both sides. Both, Evelyn suspected. The 5 men Victor had placed in the service corridors were a different problem. Evelyn's security team found 2 of them. Marcus found a 3rd attempting to access the hotel's electrical systems in the basement, which would have killed the building's power and the AV system with it. Too late to stop the recording, which had played in its entirety, but enough to create the kind of chaos that allowed people to move through buildings unseen. Marcus had handled the 3rd man with a thoroughness that he reported to Evelyn in a single text. "Basement secure. You don't want details." The remaining 2 were unaccounted for when the federal vehicles pulled up outside. Okafor came in with 8 agents and the particular controlled energy of someone who had been building toward this moment through legitimate channels for longer than Evelyn had been building toward it through her own, and whose frustration at the pace of those legitimate channels was visible in the set of her jaw, even as her face maintained the professional neutrality required of her position. She was 50, black, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses pushed up on her head in a way that reminded Evelyn, with a jolt she didn't have time for, of her own glasses on the morning the invitation arrived. Okafor took one look at the ballroom, the overturned table, the glass on the floor, Victor Salazar sitting in a chair with Damien standing 3 feet away, and 2 of Damien's men in his peripheral vision. The 320 guests compressed toward the center of the room with the particular shell-shocked quality of people who had paid a great deal to attend an event that had become something else, and said to Evelyn, who had met her at the entrance, "Give me the 60-second version." Victor Salazar has been running a parallel financial operation inside the Moretti organization for 6 years, diverting funds through subsidiary structures your office has been partially aware of. He fabricated evidence to remove me from the organization 5 years ago because I was close to exposing it. Tonight he attempted to use this event as cover for a coup, transfer of organizational control using a combination of physical intimidation and the absence of the evidence I'd been building with Agent Harmon, who has been suspended pending investigation, Okafor said. Yes, Victor has someone inside your office. I don't know who beyond Harmon, but the access to the subpoena filing suggests it wasn't only Harmon. Okafor's jaw tightened. The recording. 47 minutes. Clear audio, identified speakers, operational detail sufficient for RICO application. My analyst can provide provenance documentation within the hour. And Moretti? Evelyn looked at Damien across the room. He was watching the federal agents move in with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is watching the consequences of it arrive in real time. Not resisting, not performing cooperation either, just standing there with blood drying on his face and the particular stillness of someone who has run out of things to manage and is waiting for what comes next. Cooperating, Evelyn said. Okafor looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Stay available," and moved toward Victor. It was in the movement toward resolution, the agents fanning out, Okafor's voice crisp and authoritative cutting across the ballroom's residual noise. The beginning of the long procedural machinery that would grind through this night and the next several months. That Evelyn felt it. Not relief, not satisfaction. Something more physical than either of those. A sudden awareness of her own body that had been absent during the operational focus of the last 2 hours. Her feet were still bare. She had left her heels in the stairwell. The marble floor was cold. Her shoulders ached in a way that told her she had been holding them tense for so long the tension had stopped registering. There was a small tear at the hem of her dress, somewhere between the stairwell and the ballroom, that she hadn't noticed until now. She became aware of all of this in the span of about 4 seconds. Then her phone buzzed, and it was Marcus. "Luca's asking for you. Not upset, just asking." She typed back, "Tell him I'll be there in 10 minutes. Tell him everything's handled." A pause. Then Marcus. "He said to tell you he figured." She almost smiled. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and did not. She was standing near the ballroom's north wall when Damien reached her. He'd come from across the room. She'd tracked his movement peripherally while keeping her attention on Okafor's team, and he stopped beside her, not in front of her, both of them looking out at the room rather than at each other, which felt like an arrangement they'd arrived at by unspoken mutual agreement. "The 2 missing men," she said. "Caruso found one in the parking structure," he said, "trying to reach a vehicle." He paused. "The 6th is unaccounted for. Building's locked down. Okafor has people on all exits." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. His breathing had evened out completely now. "You built all of this," he said. 3 years. "Yes." The contacts, the recording, the security team in the ballroom. "Yes." He was quiet again. She could feel the specific quality of his silence. She had spent 4 years learning the different textures of Damien Moretti's silences, and this one was the kind that meant he was not withholding something, but constructing it, finding the architecture of what he needed to say before he committed to saying it. "I should have let you speak," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should have." "That's not—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not asking you to. I'm not making a case for anything. I'm just saying it because it's true, and it's 5 years overdue, and I don't know what comes after it, but I know it has to come first." She turned to look at him then. The cut above his eye had stopped bleeding, dried to a dark line. The collar of his shirt was still open, the jacket still gone. He looked like a man at the end of something, not defeated, the distinction was important, but emptied of the particular armor that the beginning of an evening always required. "It comes first," she said, "and then we figure out what comes after." He held her gaze, nodded once. Then he looked back at the room, at Okafor's team working through it with professional efficiency, and she saw him do something she had watched him do 100 times, take inventory, assess, find the shape of what remained. "The organization," he said. "Yes." Victor's been running half of it independently for 6 years. When this unravels, and it will unravel completely, the structure that's left is going to be exposed, she said. Yes, but then you'll have to decide what you want to build on it, she said, or whether you want to build anything. He didn't answer immediately. She hadn't expected him to. This was not a decision that got made standing in a ballroom at 10:30 on a Saturday night with federal agents processing a crime scene around them. This was a decision that took time and cost something, and Damien had always understood the weight of decisions that cost something, which was one of the things. She acknowledged it to herself with the clarity that exhaustion sometimes produced, one of the things she had respected about him. "Your sons," he said, quietly. "My sons," she confirmed. "I want—" He stopped. The word want seemed to require more from him than most words did. "I want the chance to know them. If you're willing to, if that's something you'd consider." She thought about Nico at the kitchen window asking why the dog still ran even when it knew where home was. She thought about Luca's assessment face outside the school door on Thursday morning. She thought about Marco at the ballroom entrance, looking up at a stranger with his own gray eyes and saying, "That's weird," with perfect, uncomplicated honesty. "One step at a time," she said. "One honest step at a time." He exhaled. It was a small sound, barely audible beneath the noise of the room, but she heard it. Then Santos appeared at Evelyn's shoulder, breathing harder than usual. "Ms. Carter." His voice had the specific compression of someone delivering urgent information at controlled volume. "The sixth man! He's on the 4th floor." Everything in Evelyn's body went cold. "Room 4312, Santos said. "He got past the fire exit. Marcus is— there's a situation." She was moving before Santos finished the sentence. Damien was a half step behind her. She registered this without turning around. Through the ballroom, past Okafor's team, into the east corridor, the cold marble under her bare feet barely registering, through the stairwell door that she hit with both hands and took the stairs at a run, 2 at a time, the dress hampering her, and she grabbed the hem with her left hand and pulled it up and kept going. 3rd floor, 4th floor, door. The corridor of the 4th floor was wrong immediately. The light at the far end had changed, one of the fixtures dark that hadn't been dark earlier, and the door to room 4312 was ajar, in a way that made something in the base of Evelyn's skull go electric. Marcus was on the floor 10 feet from the door. Not unconscious, he'd pushed himself to a sitting position against the wall, right hand pressed to his left side. Santos went to him. Evelyn went to the door. "Boys," she said, pushing it open. The room was lit. The minibar was open. On the bed, Marco was sitting up, wide-eyed and very still, which was so unlike Marco that it hit her like a physical impact. Beside him, Elena had her arm around him and her face was white but controlled, the control of someone choosing it deliberately and at cost. Luca was standing. He was standing in the center of the room facing the far corner, his feet planted, his arms at his sides, and his expression was the expression Evelyn had no category for. Not fear, not exactly, something older than fear. The thing underneath fear that some people reached when the fear had been present long enough and been insufficient to change the situation. In the far corner, the 6th man. He was big. Not as big as Marcus, but built for the work, with the flat affect of someone employed for outcomes rather than judgment. He had Nico. Not violently. This was what Evelyn processed in the first half-second, the critical half-second before every instinct she possessed attempted to override every rational function she had. Nico was standing in front of the man's hand on Nico's shoulder, and Nico was perfectly still. The way he went still at the window, the way he went still when he was thinking about something no one had asked him to think about. He was 5 years old. He was in his small, dark suit with the shoes he'd negotiated for. And he was standing in the grip of a man who worked for Victor Salazar, and his face was calm, not frozen, not dissociated, genuinely, unsettlingly calm. "Okay," the man said. He was speaking to Evelyn, but he was watching the door, watching Damien, who had come in behind her. His voice had the flatness of someone following a contingency plan. Victor had given him instructions for exactly this scenario. "Everybody stays exactly where they are." "Take your hand off my son," Evelyn said. When I'm out of the building, the man said, car's waiting. I walk out, the kid stays here. That's the arrangement. There is no arrangement, Evelyn said. Ms. Carter. He said it with the patience of someone who believed the leverage was clear. There's no version of this where you do anything right now except, Mom, Nico said. She looked at her youngest son. He was looking back at her with those gray eyes that had always seen more than they were supposed to, and his expression had shifted. He had stopped being still and had become something slightly different, something that in an adult she would have called decided. I'm okay, he said, as though reporting a fact. I know, she said. He's scared, Nico said. He meant the man. He said it matter-of-factly, the way he'd observed the dog in the street, the way he observed everything. His hand is shaking. The man's grip tightened on Nico's shoulder. She saw it, the involuntary response to being seen, and then Damien moved. Not toward Nico. Not toward the man. He moved to the side, one deliberate step, putting himself between the man and the door, and he said, You know who I am. The man looked at him. Something changed in his flat affect, a flicker. You know who I am, Damien said again. Quiet. The temperature that had no heat in it. And you know that what you're holding has nothing to do with what you were hired for. Victor Salazar is in federal custody downstairs. Whatever he promised you, whatever arrangement he made, it's done. It's over. The only question left is what you walk away from tonight. The man's jaw worked. His eyes moved, Dor, Damien, Evelyn, the child in his grip, and she could see the calculation running, the contingency plan hitting the reality of the room and finding the two things incompatible. Nico reached up and removed the man's hand from his shoulder. Not struggling, not yanking. He simply took the man's wrist with both his small hands and moved it, with the particular deliberate calm of someone who has decided that the current arrangement is no longer acceptable and stepped forward out of the grip. The man was so startled by the sheer matter-of-fact quality of it that he let it happen. Nico walked across the room to Evelyn. He took her hand, the same way he'd taken it outside the school on Thursday, solid and deliberate, a statement. He looked up at her. Can we go home now? He said. Evelyn's throat closed. She opened it. Almost, she said. Behind Nico, the man in the corner looked at Damien, looked at his own hand, which Nico had returned to him, looked at the door where Santos had appeared with two of Okafor's agents behind him. He put both hands up. The next hour was procedure, and it was exhausting, and Evelyn moved through it on the reserves that people find when they've burned through everything else. Not the second wind, which was a myth, but the grim mechanical continuation that the body produces when the mind has committed to finishing something. Statements. Documentation. Okafor's team working through the building. Medical attention for Marcus, who had 2 cracked ribs and was furious about it in the specifically controlled way of people who consider injury an operational inconvenience. Marco fell asleep in Elena's arms at some point during the second hour and stayed asleep through things that should have woken him. Sirens, raised voices in the corridor, the general percussion of a building being processed by federal investigators. Luca sat beside Evelyn on the edge of the hotel room bed with his shoulder against her arm, not speaking, present in the way he'd always been present. Nico ate the rest of what Marco had found in the minibar and watched everything with the alert attention of a documentarian. At 1:15 in the morning, Okafor came to the room. She looked at Evelyn and at the 3 boys arranged around the room in various states of wakefulness, and she pulled out a chair and sat down with the quality of someone who has been standing for a very long time and is done pretending otherwise. Salazar's in custody, she said. We have the recording, your financial documentation, and 4 of his people who are going to cooperate before the sun comes up, because that's always how it goes when the thing they were loyal to has been arrested. She paused. Harmon. I need to know if he told Victor how much I had, Evelyn said. We're working through that. Our initial assessment is that he gave Victor the structure of your federal case, but not everything in the secondary system. Victor knew enough to try to neutralize your cooperation, but he didn't know about the recording. Because the recording never went through Harmon's files, Evelyn said. Correct. Okafor looked at her steadily. You built a significant amount of infrastructure around not having a single point of failure. I learned that from someone, Evelyn said. Okafor's eyes moved briefly to the door, where, through it, in the corridor, Damien Moretti was giving a statement to two of Okafor's agents with the measured cooperation of a man who has decided that this is the path and is committing to it without qualification. Moretti's going to be complicated, Okafor said. The organization he's led has— I know what it's done, Evelyn said. He knows what it's done. Whatever comes next is his to navigate with your office. I can't speak to that, and I won't try. Okafor nodded slowly. The recording is going to open things we haven't fully mapped yet. Victor's operation had connections we're still tracing. This goes longer than tonight. I know, Evelyn said. Are you going to be all right? Okafor said. Not procedurally, just asking. Evelyn looked at her three sons, Marco unconscious and serene, Luca solid beside her, Nico watching Okafor with his unreadable, steady gaze. She looked at the tear in the hem of her midnight blue dress. She thought about heels in a stairwell and cold marble and a 47-minute recording that had taken 3 years and the specific quality of controlled fury to build. Yes, she said, and meant it in the complicated way that yes sometimes means. Not that everything was resolved, not that the cost hadn't been real, not that the next months weren't going to be hard in ways she couldn't fully anticipate, but that she was intact, that her sons were intact, that the things she had built had held when it needed to hold. Okafor stood. I'll need you at the field office Monday morning, 9 o'clock. I'll be there, Evelyn said. Okafor left. The room was quiet. The sounds of the corridor had diminished, the machinery of the night grinding on, but at a distance now, no longer immediate. Luca shifted beside her. He'd been quiet so long she'd half thought he was asleep, but his eyes were open and he was looking at his hands in his lap with the focused inward attention he brought to structural problems. Mom, he said. Yes. The man who was in the corner, he said, the one who had Nico. He's been taken care of, she said. I know. He paused. I was standing there and I was thinking about— He stopped, started again. I didn't know what to do. I kept trying to figure out what to do and I couldn't find it. She looked at her eldest son. At 8 years of age, at 5, she corrected. Always 5. Though sometimes he seemed older. At 5 years old, standing in the center of a room, trying to solve a problem that had no clean solution, feet planted, refusing to leave without one. Neither did I, she said. For a moment. He looked up. Surprised, she thought, that she would say this. What did you do, he said, when you didn't know? I waited, she said. I stayed still and I watched and I waited for the thing that I could actually do. And then I did it. He thought about this. Then he nodded, in the way he nodded when something had been filed and would be referenced again. He leaned back against her arm. From the corridor, through the door, she heard Damien's voice, still giving his statement, steady, detailed, not minimizing, and she heard it land somewhere in her chest the way it always had. And she let it land and did not build a wall around it. Not tonight, because tonight the walls had cost enough already. Nico looked up from what remained of the minibar's contents. He looked at the door. He looked at Evelyn. Is the man in the hallway our father? He said. The room was very quiet. Marco slept on, unbothered. Luca went still beside her in a different way than before. Evelyn looked at her youngest son and thought about the long road from a car in the dark with $300 to this room. And she thought about one honest step at a time. And she thought that some questions deserved their real answers regardless of the hour or the cost. Yes, she said. Nico looked at the door again, then back at her. Then he picked up the last item from the minibar, a small package of crackers, and offered it to Luca, who took one, and then held the package toward the door in a gesture that was somehow both completely literal and not literal at all. The crackers sat on the nightstand untouched until morning. Damien had come in an hour after Nico's gesture, after Okafor's team finished his statement, after the corridor cleared enough that the door opening didn't mean another problem arriving. He'd knocked. Evelyn had said, "Come in." He'd stood in the doorway of a hotel room where 2 of his sons were asleep, and one was watching him with the patient attention of someone who had already decided something and was waiting for the situation to catch up to the decision, and he had looked at all 3 of them for a long moment without speaking. Then he'd pulled the chair from the desk to the wall beside the door and sat in it, not claiming space, not performing presence, just there. Evelyn had not told him to leave. She had not told him to stay. She had let it be what it was, which was complicated and insufficient, and the only honest thing available at 2 in the morning after a night like this one. Nico had fallen asleep around 2:30, sideways across the foot of the bed, his shoes still on because the negotiation for their removal had not occurred, and Evelyn had decided some things were not worth the energy tonight. Luca had stayed awake the longest. She'd felt him awake beside her even after his eyes closed. The particular wakefulness of a child who is processing something too large for sleep to compete with. He'd gone under finally around 3. Damien had stayed in the chair. She wasn't sure if he'd slept. She hadn't either. She'd sat against the headboard in her ruined midnight blue dress and watched the city through the gap in the curtains do what cities do at 3 and 4 in the morning, reduce itself to its essential movements, the light traffic, the distant geometry of lit buildings, the world stripped of its performance and left with only its structure. They hadn't spoken during those hours. There wasn't a version of the conversation that could happen while her son slept 10 feet away and federal agents were still working through the building below. That conversation had a weight and a shape, and it required conditions that didn't exist yet. What existed yet was just this: a hotel room, a night that was ending, 3 children breathing, and the specific complicated silence of 2 people who had destroyed something between them and were sitting with the wreckage trying to determine if there was anything underneath it still worth examining. Dawn arrived the way November dawn arrives in Manhattan, without ceremony, the dark outside the window becoming gray without any clear moment of transition, the city resuming its full volume in pieces. By 6:30, the room was light enough that the night's damage was visible in specifics: the torn hem of her dress, the dried blood on Damien's eyebrow, the minibar standing open and comprehensively emptied. Marco woke first, as always. He surfaced from sleep with characteristic immediacy, eyes open, upright, present, and looked around the room, taking in Damien in the chair by the door with the same frank curiosity he'd applied to him in the ballroom. "You stayed," Marco said. "Yes," Damien said. His voice was rough with the night. Marco considered this. "Did you sleep?" "No." "Me neither," Marco said, with the authority of someone who had been fully unconscious for 5 hours. He looked at the open minibar. Then he looked at Evelyn. "Is there breakfast?" "We'll get breakfast," she said. "Here or home?" "Home," she said. He accepted this and began the process of locating his shoes, which had ended up under the bed by mechanisms unclear. The movement woke Luca, who came awake the way he always did. Gradually, eyes opening to immediate alertness, the processing visible. He looked at Damien. Damien looked back. Neither of them spoke, but something passed between them that Evelyn watched with the careful attention she'd learned to bring to the things Luca communicated without words. Nico woke last and did not speak at all. He sat up on the foot of the bed, looked at the room, looked at Damien, looked at the crackers on the nightstand. He picked up the crackers and ate 2 of them. Then he held the package toward Damien across the room. Damien got up from the chair. He crossed the room, took 1 cracker, and sat on the edge of the bed. The distance between him and Nico was approximately 18 inches, which was the closest he had been to any of his sons since the ballroom, and nobody said anything about it, and Evelyn breathed. She met with Okafor at 9 o'clock on Monday morning, as agreed, at the federal field office on the 15th floor of a building in Lower Manhattan, where the coffee was bad and the fluorescent lighting made everything look like a confession. Elena came with her. Reyes provided remote documentation support. The meeting ran 4 hours. The scope of what Victor Salazar had built inside the Moretti organization over 6 years was, when laid out across a conference room table in the particular clinical language of financial forensics, genuinely staggering. 11 subsidiary structures, 43 accounts across 8 jurisdictions, a parallel cash flow system that had been running alongside the organization's legitimate operations with enough structural separation that it had been effectively invisible to anyone not specifically looking for the pattern. The port contracts alone represented diversion of approximately $230 million over 4 years. He had also, Okafor told her, made significant payments to a total of 4 individuals inside the federal system. Harmon was one. The other three were in positions that explained certain investigative delays and certain document requests that had been routed to dead ends over the past 3 years. Victor Salazar had not been improvising when he found the thread connecting Evelyn's federal cooperation to Harmon. He had been maintaining a network. He had been doing this for a very long time. He was always going to be caught eventually, Okafor said. This was not reassurance. It was just accurate, and Okafor was a person who dealt in accuracy. The scale of this, it doesn't stay invisible indefinitely. The question is always who finds it first and what they do with what they find. He would have moved against Damien sooner or later regardless, Evelyn said. I just gave him a reason to move on a specific timeline. Which gave us the event, Okafor said, and the recording, and the documentation. She paused. You understand that your 3 years of intelligence gathering has saved this investigation approximately 2 years of work. I understand, Evelyn said. I'm telling you because it matters for what comes next. Moretti's cooperation has been significant. What he's provided in the last 36 hours, internal documentation, operational records, testimony on subsidiary structures we weren't aware of, it changes the prosecutorial picture considerably. Okafor set down her pen. He's going to face consequences for what his organization has done. I want to be clear about that. There are years of activity that don't disappear because Victor Salazar was doing something worse in the background. I know, Evelyn said. But there's a difference between consequences and destruction, Okafor said. The cooperation he's providing is genuine, and it's comprehensive, and it matters. What comes out of that? She spread her hands. The gesture meant, the law is the law, and I can't tell you more than that, but I can tell you the law is not indifferent to the weight of what someone puts on the scale. Evelyn drove back uptown after the meeting. She sat in the back of the car and looked out at the city and thought about weight and scales and the particular arithmetic of trying to balance a ledger that had been running crooked for a very long time. The months that followed were not clean. She had not expected them to be. The federal investigation moved the way federal investigations move, with the grinding deliberateness of institutional machinery that was built for thoroughness rather than speed, that produced documents and hearings and depositions in enormous quantity and required an equivalent quantity of response. Evelyn spent a significant portion of November and December in legal proceedings, producing documentation, providing testimony, sitting across conference tables from people who needed to understand in precise detail the construction of the intelligence network she'd built over 3 years. This was not comfortable. Some of what she'd built existed in legal gray areas that required careful navigation. Her attorneys earned their fees. Carter Capital continued operating throughout. Elena managed the firm's day-to-day with the efficiency she always brought, and the senior leadership team, who had been present at the gala, who had seen what they'd seen, was, if anything, more committed to the firm's success than they had been before. There was a particular quality to working for someone who had demonstrated, under conditions significantly more extreme than a quarterly earnings review, that she would not break. Evelyn noticed this. She was grateful for it. She did not say so frequently, because gratitude in her industry was better demonstrated through equity structures and compensation reviews than through speeches, but she noticed. Damien's situation was more complicated, as Okafor had said it would be. The legal process around the Moretti organization's activities was extensive and slow, and there were periods during the winter when Evelyn did not know, from week to week, exactly what the outcome would look like. She followed it the way she followed all significant financial and legal processes, through documentation, through her attorneys, through Reyes's careful tracking of filings. She did not involve herself in what she couldn't directly affect. She focused on what she could. What she could affect, in those months, was her sons. She had told them the truth in pieces, calibrated to what they were ready to receive and what she was ready to give. That Damien was their father, this they knew, had known since the hotel room, Nico's question and her answer having settled it in the particular way that Nico settled things, which was completely. That he and Evelyn had been apart for a long time because of things that happened between adults, things that had been complicated and painful and were not the boy's fault in any way. This took more than one conversation and more than one form across several weeks, Luca receiving it analytically, Marco receiving it with characteristic directness, and then moving on to other concerns, Nico receiving it silently in the way that meant it was being processed at a depth that would eventually produce a question she hadn't anticipated. The question arrived on a Tuesday evening in February. Evelyn was at the kitchen table with Nico after dinner, helping him with a worksheet his teacher had sent home about categorizing things, living and not living, growing and not growing, which was the kind of assignment that Nico approached with a philosophical rigor it probably hadn't been designed to accommodate. "Mom," he said, without looking up from the worksheet. "Yes." "If someone believes something that isn't true," he said, "and they do something bad because they believe it, is it still their fault?" She set down her pen. She looked at her youngest son, who was still looking at his worksheet, who had asked this question about the categorization of moral responsibility at age 5 on a Tuesday evening in February, and she thought about 5 years of carrying something she hadn't deserved and about a man sitting in a chair by a hotel room door who hadn't slept. "Yes," she said, "it's still their fault, because it was their choice to believe it without asking more questions." Nico considered this. "But it's also the fault of the person who made them believe the wrong thing." "Yes," she said, "both things can be true." He nodded. He wrote something on his worksheet. Then he said, "Is our dad trying to fix it?" "Yes," she said, "he is." Nico wrote something else. Then he put down his pencil and looked at her with those gray eyes that she had stopped being startled by, mostly with the particular directness that had been present in him since he was an infant and had never once diminished. "Okay," he said, and picked his pencil back up. Ishist. Damien came to the brownstone for the first time on a Saturday in March. Evelyn had told him to come at 10. He arrived at 10 exactly, which she had expected. He stood on the front step in a gray coat that was less formal than anything she'd seen him wear in 5 years, and held a paper bag from a bakery down the street that she happened to know made the best almond croissants in a 12-block radius, which meant he had been in the neighborhood before today. She opened the door. He looked at her. She looked at him. The morning light was coming in at a low angle, and it caught the gray at his temples and the line of the scar above his eye that the cut had left, which had healed imperfectly because he hadn't had it looked at properly on the night. And she noted all of this in the way she noted everything, which was carefully and without allowing the noting to become something she then had to manage. "You found the bakery," she said. "Elena told me," he said. She stepped back and let him in. The boys were in the kitchen. She heard them before she reached it. Marco's voice at full volume narrating something, Luca's quieter voice periodically correcting, the particular sound of breakfast in her household, which she had built over 5 years, and which was one of the things she was most unwilling to have disrupted by anything, including this, and which was also, she understood this without deciding whether it was significant or not, the thing she most wanted him to see. She brought him into the kitchen. Marco saw him first and stopped narrating. Luca looked up from his cereal, and his eyes did the assessment, and then he looked at Evelyn, and she gave him a slight nod, the kind they'd developed over years, small and clear, and he looked back at Damien. Nico, who had his back to the door and was constructing something with a piece of toast that was not going to survive the construction, turned around. He looked at Damien for 3 seconds. Then he turned back to his toast. "You can sit there," Nico said, gesturing at the chair across from him without turning around again. "That's the extra chair." Damien sat in the extra chair. Marco immediately resumed his narration, which now incorporated Damien as an audience member, whether Damien wanted to be one or not. Luca returned to his cereal, but with the peripheral attention operating at full capacity. Evelyn made coffee and put the croissants on a plate and set the plate in the center of the table, and the morning continued, and it was not easy. It was not clean or simple or free of the awkward weight of everything that sat beneath it, but it was honest, and it was a beginning, which was all she'd said it could be. Bum. The Moretti organization's criminal operations were formally dissolved through a combination of federal prosecution, asset forfeiture, and the comprehensive cooperation agreement Damien negotiated over the course of 4 months with Okafor's office and the U.S. Attorney. The agreement required full disclosure of all operational records, testimony and proceedings against Victor Salazar and 11 other individuals, and the structured transfer of the organization's legitimate business holdings into transparent corporate governance under independent oversight. Victor Salazar entered a guilty plea in April. The sentencing hearing was in June. Evelyn did not attend. She had what she needed from that chapter, and the chapter was closed. What remained, after the legal machinery finished its work, was the legitimate side of what the Moretti family had built over 3 generations. Real estate holdings, a logistics company, 2 hospitality groups, a portfolio of commercial properties across the Northeast. These were real businesses built on real operations, employing several thousand people who had nothing to do with anything Victor Salazar had done or the Moretti organization's criminal history. They existed. They continued. Damien spent the summer in a process that was, by any measure, the hardest work of his life. Not legally. The agreement was agreed. The framework was set. The hard work was the other kind. The kind that didn't have a legal framework or a negotiated outcome. The kind that happened in a kitchen on Saturday mornings when a 5-year-old who had his eyes asked him a question he didn't have a clean answer to, and he had to decide whether to find a clean answer or give the true one. And he always chose the true one because Evelyn had made it clear from the first Saturday in March that the true one was the only currency she would accept. He was not good at it immediately. He had not been raised for it. He had been raised in an environment where the expression of uncertainty was a liability and the acknowledgement of error was something done privately, if at all. And the particular sustained vulnerability of being known by small people who had no interest in your defenses was genuinely foreign to him in a way that sometimes showed. Luca saw it first. One morning in July, on the brownstone's back steps with the Japanese maple doing its summer thing, spreading shade across the small garden, Luca sat beside Damien while Damien was watching Marco and Nico argue about something in the garden below, and after a while Luca said, "You're trying." Damien looked at him. "Yes," he said. "I can see it," Luca said. Which with Luca was neither reassurance nor criticism. It was just documentation. The thing he did, see things clearly, and report them with the calm of someone who had decided accuracy was more useful than comfort. "Is that enough?" Damien said. He asked it simply, without the armor. Evelyn, who was inside but had the kitchen window open, heard it. Luca thought about it for a moment. "I don't know yet," he said. "But it's not nothing." Damien was quiet. Then he said, "No, it's not nothing." Bosham. The Moretti Carter Foundation's offices occupied the ground floor and first floor of what had been the Moretti family's administrative building in a neighborhood in the Bronx that had been, for 40 years, the organization's operational base and was now, through a process that had involved significant legal work and the kind of intentional discomfort that genuine change requires, being redirected toward something else. The foundation's formal launch was in October, a year, almost exactly, from the night of the gala. The event was smaller than the Ashford, deliberately. A community room, folding chairs, coffee from a shop 2 blocks away run by a woman named Dolores, who had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years, and who had attended the launch because she'd been invited, and because she was, as she told Evelyn at the coffee table, curious about whether this was real or whether it was the kind of thing that looked like change from a distance and dissolved when you got close. "I'll be watching," Dolores told her. "I'm counting on it," Evelyn said. The foundation's initial programs focused on 3 areas: educational support for families in the neighborhoods the Moretti organization had operated in for decades, a small business development fund for community entrepreneurs, and an after-school center in a building 2 blocks from the foundation's offices that opened its doors on a Wednesday afternoon in November to 47 kids between the ages of 6 and 14. Luca, Marco, and Nico attended the after-school center's opening day, which they had requested to do after being told about it. Evelyn had said yes. They arrived with Damien. This had become, over the course of the fall, a thing that happened without requiring negotiation, the 4 of them, and sometimes Elena doing things together in the ordinary way of people building something, and spent 2 hours in a room full of children their age and older doing art projects and eating snacks. Marco immediately assumed organizational responsibility for one of the art tables and began directing traffic with the natural authority of someone who has always believed that where he is, things should be happening. Luca found a corner with a 7-year-old who was working on something structural with wooden blocks, and they worked in companionable, focused silence for 40 minutes. Nico moved around the room, steady and unhurried, stopping at each station, watching each group, saying little. Near the end of the afternoon, Evelyn found Nico standing by the window that looked out onto the street. She recognized the posture. Hands not on the glass this time, just standing close to it, watching. She stood beside him. "What are you thinking about?" she said. "Whether they'll come back tomorrow," he said. "The kids?" "Yes." "Some of them will," she said. "Some won't. Not right away." He nodded. "But the ones who come back will tell the ones who didn't." "Probably," she said. He watched the street for a moment. A man walking a dog. A big one, dark-colored. Nico watched it go by. "Dogs again," Evelyn said. "Different dog," he said. But there was something in his face that was lighter than it had been a year ago, she thought. Not lighter because the weight was gone, but lighter because he'd found, as she had, that you could carry weight without being defined by it. That the carrying, done long enough and honestly enough, became part of how you moved, rather than something that prevented you from moving. She put her hand on the glass beside his. An old habit. He didn't look at her. He put his hand on top of hers, the way he'd done it at the school and in the hotel corridor and on 100 Tuesday mornings. Solid, deliberate, choosing. Across the room, Damien was talking to one of the center's staff members, a young man who had grown up in this neighborhood and who was going to run the center's tutoring program. She could see Damien listening, really listening, in the way she'd watched him learn to do over these months, without the management overlay, without the authority posture, just receiving what the other person was saying as though it mattered because it did. He still got it wrong sometimes. He still reached for the armor when the conversation got close to something real. But he got it wrong less than he had in March, and that trajectory was what she'd said she needed to see, and she was seeing it. He looked across the room and found her at the window. She held his gaze for a moment. He didn't smile. Damien was not a man who smiled frequently or without reason, but something in his face changed in the small, specific way she'd learned to read over a year of Saturday mornings and depositions in folding chairs. She looked back out the window. The street was ordinary. People moving through a November afternoon, carrying things, going places, doing the work of being alive in a city that didn't ask about your history before it let you walk its sidewalks. Somewhere down the block, someone was cooking something, and the smell of it reached them even through the closed window. Or maybe it was just the suggestion of it, warmth, the idea of it, something that had been made with intention for people to share. Evelyn thought about a black envelope on a kitchen counter and $300 in the back of a car. She thought about a studio apartment and 3 infants and the specific kind of rage that had kept her upright when nothing else would. She thought about $11 billion and a midnight blue dress and heels left in a stairwell and a recording that had taken 3 years to build and 1 evening to spend. She thought about Dolores saying, "I'll be watching with the particular hard-eyed attention of someone who had seen too many things dissolve when you got close." She thought about what didn't dissolve. Behind her, Marco was explaining something at volume to a group of children who appeared fascinated. Luca and the 7-year-old had built something tall enough that they were both standing to assess it, heads tilted at the same angle. Nico was still at the window, hand over hers, watching the street in the focused, patient way of someone who has decided that paying attention to what is actually here is more useful than anticipating what might arrive. The invitation had been meant to break her. Victor had designed it carefully, the public setting, the audience, the engineering of maximum humiliation for a woman who was supposed to arrive alone and diminished and be seen that way by everyone who mattered. He had miscalculated in the specific way that people who think in terms of power always miscalculated when they encountered someone who had learned to think in terms of something else. You couldn't humiliate someone who had already rebuilt herself. You couldn't diminish someone who had spent 5 years refusing to be diminished. The invitation that was supposed to end her had simply shown her where the battle was. She had shown up to it in midnight blue with 3 sons who had their father's eyes, and she had brought everything she'd built in the dark. And she had let it be enough. It had been enough. Outside, the November light was going orange and low. the way it did in the city this time of year when the buildings caught the last of the afternoon sun and held it briefly before the dark came. Evelyn watched the light move across the street below and felt the warmth of her son's hand on hers and heard behind her the sound of her family, the whole complicated, imperfect, genuinely alive fact of them, filling a room in a neighborhood that was trying, like all of them, to become something better than what it had been. She did not look for the word that described this. Some things resisted language and were truer for it. She stood at the window and let the afternoon finish itself, and she was present in it, and that was enough, and she was done.